Good evening to you, Professor Jen. Lecturecast, week number 5, seminar on sexual violence. Happy to be with you. Thank you for letting me into your virtual world. And I have my notes with me this evening, so if I look away, it's only because I want to make sure I cover everything. And so many of you have asked me to address in my lecture cast this week some particular subjects. I'm happy to oblige. So before we begin again, thank you for letting me come into your virtual world. And thank you for captioning services, as we couldn't do this without you. So you're truly appreciated. Tonight I'm going to discuss a couple things. There'll be a brief lecture, but some things for you to think about that you've asked me to discuss, and that would be, of course, victims who have multiple circumstances of victimization. And of course, no means no. So let's start with multiple victimization. Years ago in my career, a long time ago in a land far, far away, when I wasn't so tired and I was much younger, I would listen to women and men, and they would tell me that they were victims of sexual assault, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. And I would think to myself, automatically, this must be with the same perpetrator. And then I'd find out, no. I'd find out that the first time was a brother, the first time was a sister, the second time was an aunt, and then a next door neighbor, and then a school teacher. And at first I thought to myself, how is this possible? Is these people making this up? How is this possible that somebody can be raped and sexually violated by so many people? And now that I'm going to be 50, you see, and I have a lot of experience behind me, and I understand a lot more than I used to, I've come to terms with the fact that some persons are separated from the herd. And what I mean by that is that they often don't have enough skill set to protect themselves, and they also don't have enough skill set to protect themselves from other perpetrators. And it's not blaming the victim whatsoever, but for some reason, they're perceived as weak and easy targets. I remember 2 cases in particular I'll speak about tonight, and then we'll go into no means no. I had a fellow when I worked at Groveland Correctional Facility who was continuously raped by the other inmates, and he never really came out and told me this, but I knew of it because he would come to my office and I ran some educational programs. He would have bruises all over his eyes, his face, and he'd have choke marks on his neck. And then the rumor would get out that, and please pardon my English, but I can't clean this up for you. You want to be in this field, you want to take these classes, this is how it is. And I would hear things in the hallway that so and so was somebody's pussy. And I knew exactly what this meant in prison speak. It meant that he was raped by various other inmates, and now he was owned by them. And we'll just call him John, I suppose, for the sake of anonymity. And he was raped through the entire amount of incarceration he was in Groveland. And he was heterosexual. He came in heterosexual. He wound up leaving heterosexual. He was actually a father of 2 children, at one time married. And he was in his late 20s when he first came into the system. And he had this little hobby where he liked to drink and drive. So that's a little aside there, that it's not a good idea to drink and drive and make that a hobby. But anyway, he wound up doing 3 years of a sentence. And I would say by cultural standards, he was rather handsome, though I wasn't there checking men out. I was already married, professional person. But by cultural standards, he was very handsome. And then the more that he got raped, the more of a power and control and game it became to the other inmates. And I noticed something very interesting in John, that he started becoming dirty in his appearance. His cleanliness wasn't so great. His teeth were suffering. His hair wasn't washed. And one of the other inmates explained to me gently, because I guess he thought, I had to brace myself for this. He explained to me that by John not keeping up with his maintenance, his personal maintenance, that would perhaps deter future sexual assaults against him. even though, of course, he said no, and no should always mean no. I saw this with women very frequently, especially working with prostitutes, where Johns would pick them up and offer to pay them for sexual activity. And then what would happen is that the Johns would wind up raping the women and not paying them at all, or paying them a small portion, or paying them the full portion, but then changing the terms and conditions of the contract. I mean, think about it. What prostitute, male or female, is going to call 911 and say that they were raped because they were in the midst of having a contract disagreement with their John or Jane? That's what we call a female person who buys a prostitute. And who's going to admit that they just broke the law in order to file charges? It like just doesn't make any sense. And I would often have clients that would tell me really hard things, men and women, that were prostitutes especially, and they would become horrible targets of sexual abuse and sexual violation. And I remember when I ran John's school, I actually ran John's school here for 2 years, where the Johns would get assigned to me. So I guess I was their worst nightmare, you know. And I would have to figure out community service for the Johns. And sometimes I would ask the Johns, why did you do this to this prostitute? Why did you anally rape her when the agreement or contractual agreement was, a vaginal or oral contract? And they would say to me, well, I wanted to get what I couldn't get at home, or I wanted to hear her scream. It was so callous. And really frightening, because most of these Johns didn't go to prison for rape whatsoever. They were picked up on what at the time was a Class B misdemeanor, which is really very depressing. And then they go back out. I see these same Johns year after year scoping out newer and younger girls on Lyle Avenue. And they really had no shame in seeing me after I knew exactly what they did to these women. Just very different, different world. Also, in No Means No, in two films I want to talk about briefly this evening with you, because they seem to. Oh, Meadow wants to be on camera. This is little Meadow Soprano, so we'll give her a little hello, and then she's going to have to go elsewhere. So that's the best we can do. Meadow, goodbye. Okay. So one of the films happens to be the film Precious. Many of you have seen the film, and you've talked about the film in the lecturecast, and you speak about how you can't believe that, of course, she's violated by her biological father, impregnated by him not once but twice. Her mother is well aware. It's also suggested in the film, if you need me to go over with you where, you can email me, that her mother also sexually violates her. There's a scene in the film where the mother is obviously masturbating and suggests to Precious that she come in and spend some time with her mother. And then there's this other horrid scene in the film Precious, where the neighborhood boy throws her down in the street and proceeds to rape her on the sidewalk, and everybody laughs. And this is a reality sometimes of sexual violence, that one person can suffer victimization from many people. Even though they've said no, it seems to fall upon either, unlistening ears, or persons that feel that they have no self-worth, therefore their no is meaningless. Another place where we find no means no is very difficult in criminal law is in marital situations, whether it's same sex or opposite sex. And in a marital situation, this is very new in our culture that we even talk about these things, because marriages, regardless of whether they're same sex or opposite sex, whatever, they're considered private, and sexuality, by most religious standards, is a coveted sort of private agreement between the parties. When you talk to most married couples, you'll find that no doesn't always mean no. And that sometimes, and it doesn't matter if it's a man and a woman, two men or two women, you'll find in these unions, whether it's legal marriage or a long-term partnership, whatever, that sometimes a partner will talk about how they felt very violated by another partner, because he or she had to give in when clearly they didn't want to have sexual contact with their spouse or mate. A lot of men self-report that they have felt very often victimized by a woman, especially who was maybe very forceful emotionally and not accepting the word no because maybe she wanted to get pregnant, and there's really only a 3 or 4 day window in most women's uh, anatomy where they can get pregnant. And very often men will self-report much later down the line that they felt really very violated, that their no didn't mean no. Um, Sometimes in the reverse, of course, um, women also report that maybe their companion, usually a male, and this is an example I can offer that I've heard very frequently, and I speak honestly, so this isn't meant to embarrass anyone. After a woman gives birth, she really shouldn't have sexual intercourse vaginally or really anally or whatever in that region down south for at least 6 to 8 weeks because a lot's gone on down there. A little person came out of there, and it's just you're susceptible to a lot of infections and you're healing, and there's usually stitches and things were once one size, now they're another size, and they have to really heal, you know. And doctors usually tell a woman if she's had a vaginal birth that she shouldn't have any sexual or anal intercourse for 6 weeks. And if she's had a C-section, cesarean section, she shouldn't have any relations in that fashion for about 8 weeks, meaning 2 months. In our culture, very often what happens, and I can't really speak about same-sex couples that have children because I don't have enough experience. But what happens in the heterosexual coupling is that our culture, Western culture, focuses so much on the woman that she's usually the one that gets the baby shower, everybody wants to touch her stomach, she's the one that's undergoing all these physical changes, and very often the men they self-report a common feeling that they feel very ignored. And one of the things that the CDC, Center for Disease Control, came out in 2010 as newest statistics is that in a married couple situation or a long-term situation where the woman becomes pregnant by the man that she's living with, if he's going to have an affair, it's usually the last trimester of her pregnancy. And that seems to be more common than we realize. And it's because, again, that's when the showers are occurring and all the attention and the due date's getting closer and the nursery's getting built. And maybe men in Western culture feel that they've had a departure from the intimacy that they had with their partner. Anyway, many women, I was speaking to a healthcare provider 2 weeks ago at the Susan B. Anthony House. We were talking about women's um, right to get medical care and self-reporting and advocacy. And she said that she sees a lot of women across all socioeconomic incomes that come into clinics, especially because they're embarrassed to go back to their doctor. So they go to a clinic after they've given birth, and usually they sometimes have to have repaired stitches in the vaginal area, or they complain of a lot of pain or excessive bleeding, swelling, inflammation, inability to urinate. I mean, this list can go on until midnight tonight, and it won't because we have other things to do. But the bottom line is that what happens is that no doesn't mean no because the partner wants some level of intimacy. Well, what that really boils down to is partner rape. Just like the example I gave to you, where a man might not feel that he wishes to be intimate, and a woman is going to insist on him being intimate, maybe for pregnancy reasons or whatever. And so this woman, Susan Thayer, very interesting woman, Thayer, she started explaining that a lot of women in her line of work, she runs these clinics, she said that they would come in and she said you could see that they had, doctors, but they were so embarrassed that they'd have to admit that their partner forced them to have sexual intercourse. And they just really wanted some medical care and never come back there again. And what this does then is that it makes it so then that the person's physician or obstetrician never really knows of what happened because the records aren't shared. So what happens to the woman's mind after she goes then to live with this partner and then realizes that no doesn't always mean no, and it sets up some very awkward circumstances in relationships, and a lot of misunderstandings, and a lot of very hurt feelings. And there are some marriages, believe it or not, I know a lot of you have a hard time believing me, but you don't have to believe me, where in our culture, um, not so much my generation, but probably my mother's generation, for sure my grandmother's generation. My grandmother would have been 104 if she were alive today. My mother would have been, I don't know, 70 something if she were alive today. And I remember overhearing conversations that they would have with other women or neighbors, whatever, of different ethnic groups. So this wasn't limited to a particular ethnicity. And I didn't understand the language at the time, but basically they would talk about a woman's duty, not duty like going to the bathroom duty, 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 and that there were certain things expected of a female, whether she wanted to have relations or not in a marital situation. I remember overhearing things that included with, well, that's what a wife owes her husband, or that's her job, or that's a wife's duty. And really, it all goes back to no means no. And it's still a very touchy subject in our culture about marital rape. For a brief period of time, I used to work for the Sarah Hotline here in Rochester, New York, and it's predominantly, it deals with Jewish households that would call. There's 25,000 Jews supposedly living in Rochester, New York. I think that number is a little inflated, but that's a whole other discussion. But anyway, they would call on the hotline, and we would hear about economic abuse, and we would hear about social abuse and religious abuse. But man, oh man, did we hear about sexual abuse, and that no didn't mean no. And very often it accompanied many beatings. And soon enough, we started hearing from the Muslim population, because the Muslim population and Jewish population are very similar in dietary laws and their belief about Deuteronomy, this idea of be fruitful and multiply and all this other business. And the reason the men get away with it so easily in the Muslim and Jewish populations, in my opinion, in Rochester and probably globally, is because the women are covered head to toe in so much fabric that it's hard to see that he's beaten her, because she's not walking out in a tank top. And very often in those 2 years on the phone, I would hear really gruesome details of of husbands insisting on sexual activity that the wives didn't want, even though they had said no. So I leave you with those thoughts, those couple of thoughts. No means no. It doesn't matter who the population is, and the idea of victimizing, re-victimization, not only by one person as an assailant, but by multiple assailants against one victim. And again, I'm thrilled to take your questions on these lecture casts to help prepare my notes for next week. If there's something you'd like me to address specifically, I'm happy to take that from you. And if not, I have enough material to last me for a lifetime. But I wish you well as always. I hope you stay safe, and I hope we get some spring weather soon. And again, I thank you for letting me come into your virtual lives, your academic worlds, and keep up the good work, and have a lovely midterm week. And always be well. And good night to you.